Today's book is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. That's right, Frankenstein. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, why are you just reading this book now, at your age? You should have read this 20 years ago when you were 17 or something like that. And you're right, I should have. I'm embarrassed that I've not read the book up until this point and that I'm only just reading it now, but yeah, what can I say? Better late than never. Actually, there are a few reasons why I'm only just kind of getting to this book around now. Perhaps the largest reason is that I had read an abridged version of this as a child, so I knew the story, which kind of completely satiated my curiosity. So, like, if I didn't know what the story was, I imagine I probably would have read this when I was 14 or 15 or 16 or something like that, just because I would have been so curious to find out, you know, like, what's the story of the original Frankenstein. But in my case, I'd already read the original. I had already read the story in an abridged version, not the original. So the only real point to reading the original is to kind of, I don't know, be a snob about these things or kind of get all the details or stuff like that. But the basic beats of the story I had already known since about 7 years old. Now, I don't know if anyone else remembers this who grew up in the 80s, but Fisher-Price released a series of classic comic books. I believe I've looked this up in the internet since. Apparently the comics were originally published by Marvel in the 1970s as like a classic book, comic book series. And then Fisher-Price in 1984 re-released 6 of these books with an accompanying audio cassette. And, you know, you could read and listen with the audio cassette, and then, you know, whenever there would be a chime, you'd kind of turn it to the next page to help teach kids to read or something like that. And we had this at my house. We had the whole collection, for what it's worth. We accumulated them gradually. I think my parents used them to keep us quiet on long car trips. So whenever we went on a long car trip, we'd get a new book and cassette tape, and we'd put it in the cassette tape, and we'd kind of listen and follow along with the book, and it would keep us perfectly quiet for 40 minutes or whatever. And Frankenstein was one of them. We got it on a car trip, but then after the car trip, then it just kind of became part of the toy collection. And I listened to that thing over and over and over again. I don't know. Kids like to listen to the same stories over and over and over again. I don't know why. The audio cassette was nice. It was a dramatic reading. The comic book had pictures. I remember, actually, one memory I have of this is I wanted my grandfather to read it to me. Why did I need him to read it to me? I don't know, because I already had the cassette tape. But, you know, it's just something kids do. Like, they like adults to read their stories to them. And I kind of, like, in the back of my mind, I was saying, Grandpa's a bit conservative. Maybe Frankenstein's not the best story. But then I was also thinking, well, it's a classic story. You know, you can't really criticize the classics. This was all kind of in the back of my mind at 7. So I asked him to read it to me, and, you know, like, to his credit, he obliged me. He humored me a lot. But as we went through the story, he was kind of just getting more and more frustrated. And he's like, all these people dying just because he created this monster. It's all his fault. And getting kind of more and more worked up about it. So eventually I just said, oh, Grandpa, it's okay. You don't have to finish the story. And so, like, that kind of carried me through, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then kind of all through my teenage years. I never really read the story. It's always kind of in the back of my mind as kind of something to read someday. But, like, I knew the story, so I didn't really feel like wading through the novel. And the novel is old, you know, published in 1817. I think it was written in 1817, published in 1818, which, by the way, 200 years exactly now, so bicentennial anniversary. How's that for timing? Anyways, then when I got to college, this book, believe it or not, was required reading for History 102, which was one of the core history classes. Now, I never took History 102. I took History 101 because as a college freshman I was more interested in ancient history. Most of my friends were more interested in modern history, to the extent they were interested in history at all. So they took History 102, and this was assigned reading for them, but not for me because I did History 101. And like when they told me Frankenstein was assigned reading, I was kind of like, oh, right. What is Frankenstein doing as assigned reading? Like, isn't that just some stupid horror book? I mean, like, I knew it was a classic, but I thought it was like a classic because it was a classic horror book. I didn't think it was like a classic book you'd read in history class. But apparently, and again, I never took this class, apparently it was assigned reading because it so kind of perfectly illustrated the mindset of the Romantic movement. And, you know, I guess the Romantic movement, which was kind of the late 1700s, early 1800s, was kind of, you know, something that got studied in modern history classes. So that piqued my interest, that this was not just some dumb horror book, but this was like, you know, philosophical book, that it was a romantic book. Because, you know, like, who would think Frankenstein is a romantic book? Now, it's not romantic like lovey-lovey, kissy-kissy, like romantic small r. It's romantic movement, capital R, which is kind of this movement which is based on kind of emotions and nature, and I don't really know. The kind of historical romantic movement, and you know, kind of the sense of romanticism, not like love type stuff. But still, you know, you think of Frankenstein as horror, you don't think of it as a romantic book, kind of in any sense of the word. So that surprised me, and that piqued my interest. But all of my friends who had to read this book hated it. They didn't like the book. They hated that they had to read it. They just hated it, hated it, hated it. And I had to listen to them complaining about this book in the college dormitories. And it kind of more or less kind of put me off the book for years afterwards. They thought it was too long-winded, too talky, you know, just lots of kind of long digressions and descriptions and stuff like that. And in fact, not only my college friends, this is an opinion I've often heard kind of said to me over the years from people I've met since then. I had a coworker at my previous job who didn't like this book, and he says, yeah, that monster. He said, any monster who can spend like 50 pages talking, because, you know, the monster goes on in this long monologue in the middle of the book. Any monster who can spend about 50 pages talking just can't be scary. And I thought, yeah, who wants to read like a 50-page monologue where just the monster's talking? So all that has kind of put me off the book. On the other hand, I've always kind of wanted to read it someday, just, you know, just to say I've read it, like it's a classic, right? So I'm in this book club now, and there's a couple people in the book club with me who are in the exact same predicament. They've never read this book before. They've always kind of been meaning to get around to it because it's a classic. And so it's been kind of on our back burner for months. We've always been like, well, what about Frankenstein this month? And then we choose a different book, but then we're like, oh, let's do Frankenstein next month. And then we choose a different book. But eventually, we decided to do it. We decided to do it for October because we thought, hey, it's October. Perfect time to do Frankenstein. And we thought, we'll finish it by Halloween, and then we'll discuss it on Halloween Day, and won't that be cool? And the other two totally didn't finish it. I was the only one who was on track to finish it. I was about 50 pages away from the end a few days before Halloween, and I said, yeah, I can finish it. And the other two said, no, we can't do it. So we put it back a week, and then we met up the first week in November, which wasn't nearly as cool, but there we are. So we finished it, and now here I am with the review. So, what to say about this book? Well, my friends at college weren't wrong. It is very slow moving. There's lots of descriptions and lots of kind of monologues and stuff like that. But I had the advantage of being forewarned about all that, which, you know, if you're forewarned, it completely changes your attitude. Because you're not reading and you're like, why isn't this getting to the action? When is something going to happen? You're like, oh yeah, I knew this was going to be long and talky. This is exactly what I expected. So, you know, it kind of puts you in the right mindset. And I wasn't in a hurry for it to get anywhere. I knew it was going to go on all these digressions, and I just didn't even care because I'd been warned about it. The other thing as well, I think this is maybe one of those rare cases where having the book spoiled for you in advance actually helps to increase your enjoyment of the plot. Because the other two people in my book club didn't actually know what the plot of this book was going to be. They didn't know who was going to die when, so to speak. And so like they ended up enjoying it well enough a little bit, actually. But I pity them a little bit because, like they must have been, all right, when are we going to get to the horror or the deaths or something like that? And they have to read all these long descriptions and talks. And for me, like I knew exactly what it was going to happen. So I wasn't like impatient to get to it. I just thought, okay, the book's going to take its sweet time. I know who's going to die when anyways. We'll just kind of go at the book's own pace. So yeah, that all helped. It is kind of a long book with like lots of talking and descriptions and stuff like that, but being in the right mindset helps. Also, like kind of, I guess, again, knowing that this book is kind of the quintessential book of the Romantic movement maybe helps you appreciate it a bit more. When he's going on about all this stuff about nature and all the wonderful things about nature, I'm like, oh yeah, Romanticism, of course. They love to talk about how wonderful nature is. So like I wasn't like, what is this doing in this book? I thought this was supposed to be scary. I was like, oh right, okay. Makes sense, Romanticism. Interesting thing, something that both of the other people commented at the book club meeting is they said, boy, this book wasn't scary at all. And it's not. And it's not that you expect it to be scary because like it was written in 1817. So like everybody knows anything old isn't scary because our generation has just been desensitized to the extent no previous generation has ever been desensitized to media violence. We've seen it all on TV before. After seeing all those slasher films and stuff like that, there's no way a novel from 1817 could possibly scare you. So like nobody expects it to be scary, or if you do, you shouldn't. But the thing that surprised me slightly is the novel wasn't even trying to be scary. Like, it's not like it was trying to be scary and it failed because it was old. She's not even really going for scariness here. It's not supposed to be a horror novel at all. There are sections where she's definitely going for a little bit of an eerie vibe. Like it's gothic. She sets a lot of eerie scenes. Like, there's a scene where he's kind of first meets the monster, or not first, but because he created the monster. But after he'd been separated from the monster for a long time, and he first kind of sees him again, it's kind of like on a stormy night, and he's out in front of the lakeside at night, and then like the lightning flashes, and he sees that the monster's kind of standing right in front of him. That kind of scene setting is like delightfully eerie. Like that's all good. That's perfect, like eerie vibe. But it's not supposed to be scary at all. Like there's no kind of build up to any of the deaths. In fact, you never even see any of the deaths. You just kind of like, you encounter a dead body and you're like, oh, the monster is struck again. And what I realized I was reading the book, which I didn't really come through so much in this Fisher-Price abridged version I read as a kid. But she spends like, the author Mary Shelley, spends like the first half of the book or more kind of building up all these wonderful relationships that Frankenstein has. Like Henry Clairvaux is just this wonderful friend who's got all these romantic ideas and is just brimming with potential, and he's going to go out and change the world. And like that, none of that came through in the abridged version I read as a kid. So you're reading the novel, and of course, spoiler alert, by the way, spoilers, last warning, spoilers. knowing what I knew, I knew Henry Clever was going to die, so I knew she was building this up so much just to make his death that much more tragic. Same thing with Elizabeth. I knew she was going to die, but like building up like this wonderful love between her and Frankenstein, and then I was like, oh right. She was just, the author was just kind of building up Frankenstein's wonderful family and wonderful relationships, just so it's that much more devastating when they all die. In other words, this is a tragedy. The emotions that she's going for is tragedy, not horror. And in a way, yeah, I guess it makes perfect sense. I think this is almost a perfectly defined tragedy in like the classical Greek term of the word. I don't know if I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, somebody let me know. Maybe I'm getting this slightly wrong, because I know in the classical Greek sense of the word, the definition of tragedy is kind of very tightly controlled. But I think this is more or less it, right? Because, you know, here's Dr. Frankenstein, and he's a man of tremendous genius. Like, he's this great man. But the one thing that makes him so great, his scientific genius, is the same thing that completely destroys him. So, like, his own hubris is his downfall. I mean, that's pretty much like a classic Greek tragedy, isn't it? And, you know, like, a lot of people die, but, like, a lot of people die in Hamlet as well. Like, that's what makes a tragedy. So, I think that's the mindset you have to go in with this book. You don't expect it to be scary, but, you know, expect it to be tragic and kind of romantic with a kind of a big R romanticism. I've been told that this was kind of the first book to do this with kind of the mad scientist trope. Of course, nowadays this is like a huge cliche, but I think this was the first, like... in fact, I think a lot of people have been calling Frankenstein the first science fiction book ever. Like, you know, people say like H.G. Wells or something was the father of science fiction, but perhaps Mary Shelley, you know, maybe this is another case of a woman getting shafted from history. Mary Shelley does not get as much credit as she deserves. Maybe H.G. Wells is not the father of science fiction. Maybe Mary Shelley is the mother of science fiction. I don't know. Oh, speaking of Mary Shelley, interesting little tidbit here. Did you know she was only 19 when she wrote this? I mean, imagine that. Imagine having one of the all-time classics of literature written, and you're not even 20 yet. I think she was 20 when it was published, but she was 19 when she wrote it. I mean, how is that for, like, life accomplishments? Like, yeah, when you haven't even finished your teenage years, and yeah, I mean, like, it's great enough to write a book, but like a book that turns out to be one of the, you know, all-time classics of literature. And it does not read like something stupid that a 19-year-old wrote. I mean, arguably, I don't know, the romanticism in here and the emotions and stuff like that, maybe, you know, if you're a bit of a jerk, you can say, typical 19-year-old obsessed with love or something like that. But like, I was very impressed not only with the prose, but with kind of her understanding of kind of like human nature and kind of what makes people tick. It's far above what you'd expect any kind of 19-year-old to have. We had this discussion in my book club about, you know, maybe people were just smarter back then because, like, you know, no YouTube and Facebook to kind of ruin people's attention spans. Maybe people went out and discussed philosophy more, even at a younger age. Or, I don't know, maybe this is just a numbers game. You know, like, 7 billion people on the earth, at least one of them has to be a genius at 19. I mean, I know there weren't 7 billion people back in 1817, but, you know, point is, like, all these people, maybe only a handful of them are geniuses at 19, but, you know, only a handful is all it takes for somebody to write this book. There is also in addition to kind of the themes, the romanticism here, there's some interesting themes going on here, which I think could easily have a religious connotation. So Frankenstein, when he's in the process of creating, like before he's created this monster, he thinks to himself, I'm going to create like this whole race of beings. They're all going to have me kind of as their creator. And they will be so thankful for me. Like he says, no child will ever be as thankful to their father as this race of beings will be to me, because I've given them the gift of life. You know, like what more could you give anyone? And so like they'll be so thankful for me forever. And then what actually happens, if you know the story, the monster gets created, and the monster completely hates Frankenstein because the monster blames Frankenstein for all of his troubles. And so you think kind of like, is this the relationship between humans and gods? Like God created us, and God thought they're going to be so thankful to me for giving them the gift of life. And then we humans, all we do is complain to God because, you know, life isn't perfect and stuff like that. Or the monster has a completely different view of the equation. Now the monster is really upset at Frankenstein because the monster is upset that Frankenstein didn't take care of him. So the monster says, you know, you are my creator, you are responsible for me. And maybe, is this the attitude that we can take with God? Like we have a legitimate complaint to make against God because God created us. Therefore, you know, He can't just kind of create us and like abandon us to this awful thing called life where all these terrible things happen. You know, God has a responsibility to look after us now that He's created us. And depending on your view of life, you could argue that maybe God hasn't done a very good job of looking after us, or at least not all of us. I mean, I can't complain personally. I've had a happy life, but like, boy, there are people there who've had a rough turn of it, especially historically, if you look at all the kind of terrible things that have happened in history. So like, yeah, I mean, which side of that equation do you fall on? Do you agree with Frankenstein that the beings that are created owe a debt of gratitude to their creator simply for having life bestowed upon them? Or do you agree with the monster that once you're created, your creator has a responsibility towards you to look after you? And I thought that was interesting. I don't think I'm reading too much into that. I think that was intended to be one of the themes of the novel. There are a number of other interesting things that kind of come up in here. There's a framing story here in the original novel, which was not at all in the abridged version, which is interesting. So they're going on, the book starts out, and it's got nothing to do with Frankenstein at the beginning. It's this guy named Walton, who's an English guy, who's writing home to his sister, and he's on this expedition to the Arctic, and he wants to find like a North Sea passage to kind of, you know, save all these sailors who have to go the long way around the world. He wants to kind of find a shortcut through the Arctic. And he's convinced that he's going to get glory and kind of save the world, and everyone will kind of be so thankful for him, and he's such a sensitive soul. And then he runs into Frankenstein, because Frankenstein's up in the Arctic hunting for the monster, although you don't know that initially. You just find out that Frankenstein's this wanderer they find up in the Arctic, and the crew of the ship is like, well, what are you doing here? Because he's floating on the ice with like the dogs and the sleigh, and Frankenstein won't even get on the ship at first. He's like, before I get on, tell me where the ship is headed. And they're like, what? You're in the middle of the Arctic floating on ice. Why do you even care whether the ship is headed? And they get him on board, and the guy Walton, who has a high opinion of himself and kind of thinks he's so like smart and intelligent and sensitive, immediately forms like a bond with Frankenstein, because Frankenstein is like a kindred spirit. They're both like highly sensitive and intelligent. And then Frankenstein tells the guy his whole life story. And Frankenstein is like, don't make my mistake. You know, don't pursue this kind of glory for irregardless of the consequences. Listen to what happened to me. which is an interesting framing story. And what makes it even more interesting is there's this weird bit at the end where after Frankenstein has finished his story, and Walton's like, oh yeah, wow, okay, I've got to be careful now. And then the sailors come up and they say, okay, this business of going into the Arctic, it's not working. We're going to go home and go back to England. This expedition is not working out. And then all of a sudden Frankenstein gets really mad and he says, what are you doing? This is your chance for glory. Are you going to turn back now when you're so close? And the reader's like, what? Frankenstein? Didn't you learn anything from that whole story you told? Now you just want to go back? And it's a really bizarre thing for Mary Shelley to put in the book. I mean, it's not bizarre, it's clever, it makes sense, but like, what is she trying to say exactly? Is she saying that Frankenstein's character is incurable? Like, he just can't help himself? Or like he thought he learned his lesson, but he didn't? Or he didn't learn his lesson? Or I don't know. And we discussed this at the book club, and nobody really knew what the point we were supposed to take away from that was. But I thought it was interesting. I thought it was like a clever little thing in this book. There were a lot of things like that where, like, you know, you think you know the story because you read the abridged version as a kid, but like there's a lot more to chew on in the novel. So, you know, if you're like me and you've only read the abridged version, it's worth just reading the original novel. It's not that long. It's like totally worth it. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here. What was I going to talk about next? The Frankenstein, the monster, the romantic movement. There's a low battery on this video, so if I get cut off suddenly, you know why. But as long as the video is still running, I'm going to try and shoehorn in one or two more things I wanted to talk about, because I knew there was more things I wanted to say, but I don't remember where they were. Actually, you know what? Maybe that's a sign that it's just time to stop here. I'm sure I'm going to think of more things to say as soon as I turn the video off, but I've rambled long enough for one day. I'm just going to stop the review here. So, I recommend it. Check it out.